My son Dale died on the 14th of October, 1988, on a skid road off Forest Road 25 in the Gifford-Pinchot, 17 miles east of Cougar, Washington. He was 22 years old, and he was a second-year choker setter for a Gippo logging outfit called Cascade West Timber. The accident report says the main line snapped at the butt rigging. It says he didn't suffer. The guys who were there, Russ Halverson, and a man named Pete, who I never did get a last name for. They told me something different, and I spent the better part of 3 years trying to drink my way past what they told me, which I won't repeat here because it doesn't belong in this story. What belongs in this story is what happened in the spring of the following year, when the grief had settled into something permanent and quieter, and I was living alone in the house Dale and his father had helped me build on 14 acres of second-growth timber off a county road near the Wind River Ranger District in Skamania County. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've ever had an encounter like this. Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. My name is Ruth Calloway. I was 46 years old in the spring of 1989. My husband Roy had been gone 9 years by then. Not dead, just gone, which is its own kind of grief and a quieter one. I worked 2 days a week at the Skamania County Assessor's Office in Stevenson, and the other days I kept to myself and the property. 14 acres sounds like a lot until you're alone on it. Then it feels like just the right size. You can walk the boundary in 45 minutes and come back knowing where everything is. I had a kitchen garden. I had 6 laying hens in a pen I'd built myself from salvage lumber. I had a wood stove and enough cord put up to last through March. And I had my dog, a black and tan coonhound bitch named Vashon that Dale had given me for Christmas of '86, who slept at the foot of my bed and was the most reliable thing in my world. I want to tell you a little about Dale, because I think it matters for the shape of what this story became. He was not a complicated person. I say that as a compliment. Some people's inner lives are a tangle, and Dale's was not. He liked physical work, the kind where you could see what you'd done by nightfall. He liked being outside in weather. He'd grown up helping Roy with the small equipment jobs Roy took on in winter to supplement the timber income. Sharpening saw chains, rigging come-alongs, patching hydraulic lines. And by the time he was 15, he could diagnose a skidder problem by ear. When Roy left in 1980, Dale was 13, and he filled in the gap in ways a 13-year-old shouldn't have to. Without being asked and without making a performance of it, he kept the wood stacked. He learned to run the chainsaw. He drove me to the grocery store in Stevenson in Roy's old Dodge pickup on his learner's permit and sat in the parking lot reading a magazine while I shopped. And when I came out, he had already loaded the bags into the bed and was holding the door open with the patience of someone much older. That's who he was. He took the choker setting job out of Cougar because it paid well, and he liked being in the timber, and he said the guys on the crew were straight with him. He was good at the work. Russ Halverson told me so at the funeral. Said Dale was the best young choker setter he'd worked with in 15 years, which was a generous thing to say, and which I believe was true. Choker setters looped the steel cable around the logs and signaled to the yarder to pull them up the slope to the landing. It is not safe work. The cables are under enormous tension, and when something fails, it fails fast. I knew that when he took the job, and I didn't say anything because Dale was 22, and it wasn't my place to say anything, and he needed the money, and he was good at it. After he died, I went through a period that I won't describe in detail here, except to say that Vashon was the only reason I got out of bed in the morning for a long time, because she needed to go out and she needed to be fed, and those two obligations were enough structure to get me upright. The assessor's office kept my Thursdays. The garden kept my hands busy in summer. The wood stove kept the winter manageable. I was surviving, which is different from living, but it was what I had, and it was enough. I want to say one more thing about Dale, and then I'll leave him where he belongs, which is in the background of this story and not the foreground. He had a way of being quiet that was different from most people's quiet. Most people's quiet is just the absence of talking. Dale's quiet was full. He could sit on the back porch with you for an hour, and at the end of it you felt like you'd had a real conversation. I don't know how that works, that quality. I've met maybe 3 people in my life who had it. What I know is that when he was gone, the silence on that porch was a different kind of silence, the empty kind, and the first time Bramble sat at the edge of the clearing while I sat on the steps, the silence changed again, became full again in a way I hadn't expected and couldn't have anticipated, and that I have never fully explained to myself. I am not saying Bramble replaced Dale. That's not what I'm saying. I am saying that grief takes a particular shape in a particular space, and that space, on my back porch, had a shape to it that Bramble, without knowing anything about it, fit into. That's all. That's the most honest thing I can say about it. After he died, I went through a period that I won't describe in detail here, except to say that Vashon was the only reason I got out of bed in the morning for a long time, because she needed to go out and she needed to be fed, and those two obligations were enough structure to get me upright. The assessor's office kept my Thursdays. The garden kept my hands busy in summer. The wood stove kept the winter manageable. I was surviving, which is different from living, but it was what I had, and it was enough. The timber on my property was second-growth Douglas fir that comes up after a clear cut grows back over 30 or 40 years. Not the old-growth giants you read about. Those were logged out of most of Skamania County before I was born. My trees were 60, 70 feet, dense enough to cut the light by 10 in the morning, with an understory of vine maple and salal and Oregon grape and all the brush that moves in after the big trees come down, and the light hits the ground for the first time in a century. Past the back of my property, the land climbed into a drainage that fed into the Wind River, and past that were sections of national forest that didn't see a person from one season to the next. That's the country I'm talking about. Remote is not quite the right word. Unpeopled is closer. The Wind River itself runs fast and cold out of the Trapper Creek wilderness, drops through a basalt canyon about 8 miles north of my property, and levels out enough by the time it passes the little hamlet of Stabler that people fish it for steelhead in the fall. I knew the country reasonably well. I'd lived in Skamania County since Roy and I moved up from Vancouver, Washington in 1971, and in the particular 5-mile radius around my property since we built the house in 1976. I knew where the elk moved in October. I knew which section of the creek bottom flooded in a heavy rain year. I knew the sound the firs made in a southeast wind versus a west wind. You learn a place over years the way you learn a person, incrementally, through repetition, and mostly without trying. The county road that runs past my property is County Road 54, which is a number that doesn't tell you much because it's a road that most people in Skamania County don't have a reason to use. It dead ends about 4 miles past my turnoff at a Forest Service gate that stays locked from October through May. In summer it gets some foot traffic, hikers going up into the Trapper Creek drainage, the occasional horseman who has a permit for the back country. In winter, it's empty. My nearest neighbor, Earl Gunderson, was about 3/4 of a mile east, and before Earl was his place, there was nothing between my house and the highway except trees and the road, and one old homestead property that a man named Whitfield had used as a summer cabin before he stopped coming up in the mid-'80s. Whitfield's cabin was visible from the road if you knew where to look, set back in the alders about 200 yards from the pavement, with a hand-lettered "No Trespassing" sign on the gate that had gone gray from the rain. I tell you this to establish what alone looks like in that country, because it informs everything that follows. When I say I didn't tell anyone, I want you to understand that there wasn't really anyone available to tell. I could have called Darlene Frost at the library, or the woman from my Sunday school class named Marge Pettibone, who had sent me casseroles for a month after Dale died. But what would I have said to either of them? What would I have said that could have been said without sounding like a woman who had gone around the bend with grief? I am going to tell you what happened. I'm going to tell it the way it happened, in the order it happened, without dressing it up. And I need you to understand, before I start, that I am not a person who has ever been interested in stories like this. I did not grow up hearing about Sasquatch. I'm not the kind of woman who buys into things she can't account for. I taught Sunday school at the First Methodist in Stevenson for 6 years, and I know the difference between faith and credulity. What I'm about to tell you is not faith, and it is not credulity. It is what I saw and what I did, and what it cost me, and I'm telling it because I'm 69 years old now, and I have carried it long enough, and I want someone else to carry it with me. It started the first week of April 1989, 6 months after Dale. The ground was still wet, the way Skamania County ground is wet from October through June, and the vine maples were just starting to leaf out, that pale spring green that looks almost yellow before it darkens. I was out behind the house filling the hen waterer from the spigot, and Vashon was doing what she usually did in the mornings, quartering the edge of the tree line, nose down, checking what had moved through in the night. She did that every morning. Bears, deer, once a bobcat. She'd smell whatever it was, get her hackles up a little, and then come back to me and shake herself loose. Normal. She was good about it. That morning she got to the northeast corner of the property, where the fence post tilts because the frost heaves it every winter, and she stopped. Just stopped. No hackles, no low whine, no alert bark. She stopped and sat down. That was the strange thing. Vashon was not a dog that sat down. Vashon was a dog that moved. I'd never seen her sit down in the field for any reason that wasn't me asking her to. I called her name. She looked at me, then looked back at whatever she was smelling, then looked at me again. Then she came back, but she walked, and she kept looking over her shoulder every few yards. I went to the fence post and looked out into the tree line. Douglas fir, vine maple, a patch of sword fern, morning light coming in low, nothing visible. But the smell was there. I need to tell you about that smell, because it comes up again, and it is the most consistent thing across the whole story. It was a musk, deep and animal, but underneath it something else, almost sweet, like overripe fruit starting to turn, but not unpleasant. Not the garbage sweetness of something dead. More like the smell you get from a blackberry cane in August when the berries have been on too long and the juice has fermented where it hangs. And under that, something I have no word for except warm. It smelled warm. That's the best I can do. Like the inside of a barn on a cold morning, but wilder. like something large was breathing nearby and the warmth of its breath had reached me before anything else did. I stood there for a minute with my hand on the fence post, and I breathed it in, and then I went back to the house, because I had somewhere to be by 9. I didn't think about it again until 3 days later, when I found the first print. I'd been cutting back salal along the south edge of the property, which I did every spring to keep it from taking over the garden. Salal is persistent. You can cut it to the ground, and it comes back from the root with a kind of stubborn patience that I have always respected even while I'm trying to kill it. I was on my knees with my loppers, and I sat back on my heels to rest for a minute, and there it was, 6 inches from my right knee in the soft ground where the slope catches the runoff. A footprint, not a boot. A bare foot, and large enough that my first thought was that it couldn't be a foot, because no foot was that large. I put my hand down flat next to it and spread my fingers wide, and the print was still half again as long as my hand, wide at the ball, narrowing to a heel that pressed in deep like the weight behind it was considerable. 5 toes. The toes were spread, not curled under the way a person's toes curl when they're walking carefully. Splayed, the way a foot spreads that has never been in a shoe. I looked around. The ground was soft enough to take prints, and there were more. 3, 4, a partial 5th. Leading out of the brush and stopping about 8 feet from where I was kneeling. They stopped. I went out along the line of them and got on my hands and knees and looked at the brush and ground beyond, and I could see where something had turned on the duff at the edge of the tree line and gone back in. The needles were disturbed in a long scrape, like something had spun and pushed off with its heel. The stride between prints was enormous. I paced it out, and it came to 52 of my inches, and I am 5'4". I looked at the depth of the impressions. Whatever had made them had pressed the soft, wet dirt down about 3/4 of an inch. I weigh 140 pounds, and I pressed the same soil down, maybe a 1/4 inch in my bean boots. The math on that, whatever it works out to, was something I felt in my chest rather than my head. I went inside, and I did not tell anyone, because there was no one to tell. That week, I started paying attention to the edge of my property in a way I hadn't before. Not afraid, exactly. Scared isn't the right word for what I felt, which surprised me. It was more like the awareness you have when there's something wild nearby that hasn't decided about you yet. Like spotting a coyote in a field, you're alert, you're watching, but the animal is watching too, and you both know it, and neither of you has moved yet. Over the next 3 weeks, I found 4 more sets of prints. They came from the northeast, always from the same direction, always stopping within 10 feet of the house, always gone by morning. The smell came with them. I started leaving the back porch light on and sitting at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee at the times I thought it might come, which was usually between 11 at night and 2 in the morning. I saw nothing for 2 weeks. Vashon knew when it was there before I did. She'd lift her head from the foot of the bed and look toward the back of the house, and her breathing would change. Slower, deeper, and then she'd put her head back down. Not alarmed, just aware. I went back to those first print sites several times over those 3 weeks and measured what I could. The stride I mentioned, 52 inches, was consistent across every set I found, which told me it was the same animal each time, or 2 animals with identical gaits, which seemed unlikely. The print width at the ball of the foot was 6 inches on the larger sets, slightly less on one set from the second week, that I eventually decided might have been the same animal moving more carefully on ground that sloped differently. the heel impression was always deep, deeper than the forefoot, which is the opposite of how a human walks. We land on our heels and push off our toes. This animal appeared to land more evenly, distributing weight across the whole foot, but the heel was digging in like something was bracing at the back of the stride. I wrote all of this down in a composition notebook I found in the mudroom that Dale had used for his hunting log in '87. I wrote in the back of it so I wouldn't disturb his entries, which were in pencil, and which I still can't read without putting the notebook back down. I want to stop here and tell you one thing, because I think it matters for everything that comes after. I was not in a good mental place that spring. I want to say that plainly. I was 6 months past losing Dale, and I was alone, and I was sleeping maybe 4 hours a night, and I had not been interested in eating a full meal since October. I am not saying this to explain away what I'm going to tell you, because what I saw was real, and I know what I saw. I'm saying it because you should know the full picture of who I was when it happened. A woman who had lost the only blood she had left on earth, and who was sleeping with the light on, and who had stopped maintaining the things you maintain when you think the future matters. That's who found it. Quick thing before we
get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, link's down below. And let's get you back to the video.
It was the second week of May, a Thursday. I know because Thursday was when I drove to Stevenson for my shift at the assessor's office, and I came home around 5 in the afternoon, which meant the light was still up and the evening was long. I parked in the gravel turnout by the house, and I was carrying a bag of groceries from the IGA, and I heard Vashon making a sound I had never heard her make. Not a bark, not a whine, something low and rhythmic, almost questioning, coming from the back of the property near the chicken pen. I set the groceries on the porch steps and walked around the house. The door to the hen pen was off its latch. I don't know how that happened, and I never figured it out. The latch was a simple hook and eye, tight enough that the hens couldn't work it themselves, but easy enough that a person or a very determined raccoon could. The hens were in the corner of the pen, not panicked, but pressed together the way chickens press together when something has alarmed them. 3 of the 6 were gone. I looked around and found them roosted in the low branches of a young Doug fir at the edge of the clearing, 15 feet off the ground, which is not where chickens roost when everything is fine. Vashon was standing at the tree line, with her nose pointed into the brush, and that low sound going. I walked up behind her and looked over her head into the trees, and there, maybe 20 feet in, down in the sword ferns where the light didn't reach well, was something I could not immediately parse. My first thought was that it was a bear cub. We got black bear cubs through that country regularly in spring, and a first-year cub separated from its mother looks helpless and small and makes you want to help it, which is exactly how it gets people hurt, because the mother is always close. But this was not a bear cub. I knew that before my eyes had finished making sense of what I was seeing, the same way you know a face is wrong before you can identify which feature is off. It was sitting in the ferns, sitting upright, the way a person sits, not the way an animal settles. Its legs were in front of it, knees up, and its arms were on its knees, and it was looking at me. The eyes were the first thing I fixed on, round and dark, with a faint amber cast that the low evening light caught for a second before it shifted. The face was, I don't have a clean word for it. It was not animal, and it was not human. but it held something of both. A broad, flat nose, a heavy brow. The lower part of the face pushed forward just slightly, not a snout, but not flat. A jaw that was wide and heavy, even for what was clearly a juvenile animal. The body was covered in short, dense hair, dark brown, almost the color of a Steller's jay in certain lights. And it was small. That was what I kept returning to. It was small. Maybe 35 pounds. The size of a 2-year-old child, but the proportions weren't a child's proportions. The arms were longer, the chest was broader relative to the body. The hands, resting on its knees. The hands were what stopped me. They were large for its size, long fingers, nails that were dark and curved slightly at the tip. And they were resting on its knees in a way that was so human, it made my throat close. I said out loud, without deciding to, "What in the world?" It flinched at my voice, just a small full-body shiver, and then stillness again. Its eyes never left me. I stood there for a very long time. Vashon was still at my heel, that low sound still going, but her tail was moving just slightly. Not wagging, just moving. The hen pen was behind me, the 3 displaced chickens still in the tree. The light was dropping, and this creature was sitting in the ferns, looking at me with an expression I can only describe as waiting. There was no mother nearby. I know you'll ask that, and I want to address it before you do, because it was the first thing I asked myself, standing there in the tree line. I scanned what I could see of the timber. Nothing moved. The smell was present, but it was coming off the animal in front of me, not from deeper in the trees. There was no sound of anything large moving in the brush. I have spent enough time in second-growth timber to know what it sounds like when there's a large animal close in the trees, and how different that is from the quiet of an empty forest. The forest behind this animal was quiet. I thought about what to do for a moment that felt much longer than a moment. The rational options were go inside and call Fish and Wildlife. Go inside and call the sheriff's office. Go inside and call anyone who had an official relationship with the problem and let them handle it. I want to be honest with you about why I didn't do any of those things. It wasn't because I didn't think of them. It was because the animal in the ferns was looking at me with those round amber eyes, and it had nowhere to go, and I was the only thing in its field of vision that wasn't a tree, and I could not make myself treat that as a problem to be managed by a phone call. Maybe that's not rational. Maybe a different person would have made different choices. I'm not asking you to approve of what I did. I'm just telling you why I did it. Later, when I had had weeks to think about it, I came to a belief about what had happened. Skamania County in the spring of 1989 had a late snowpack, heavier than usual, and the Wind River drainage had been running high and fast since March. The news at the time had one story about a mudslide on Forest Road 30 that took out about 60 yards of road surface and a section of the drainage ditch. Forest Road 30 runs along the upper Wind River corridor, about 6 miles north of where my property boundary met the National Forest. A slide event on that road would have been at elevation somewhere in the 3,000 to 4,000 foot range, in country that barely sees a person outside of elk season. I think something happened in the country above that road. I think this animal's mother may have been one of the casualties of whatever happened in that drainage, because nothing in the behavior of the animal in front of me suggested a mother that was choosing to stay back. If the mother had been alive and close, it would not have stayed. Every instinct would have pulled it back to her. Instead, it sat in my ferns and looked at me like it had nowhere else to go. That's what I believe. I can't prove it, and I'm not asking you to take it as fact. What I can tell you as fact is what happened over the next 2 weeks. I did not try to touch it that first evening. I backed away slowly and took Vashon inside and latched the hen pen as best I could and put the 3 hens back in the pen by hand, which was an adventure. In the morning it was gone. For 4 days, nothing. And then it was back. This time, it came to the edge of the clearing, out of the trees, in the evening light when I was sitting on the back porch steps. I had taken to sitting outside after dinner because the house felt very large at night, and the outside felt manageable. It came out of the tree line and stopped at the edge of the grass where I'd cleared around the house, and it stood there, not walking on 2 legs, not on 4, somewhere between, knuckle walking with the front hands, loosely on the ground, but the body upright, the head up, watching me. I had put some things out on the ground earlier in the afternoon, not because I had planned to. I had been eating a late lunch, and I had some dried apple rings left over, and some bread I'd baked the day before that had gone dense the way my bread sometimes does, and I'd been going to feed it to the hens, and instead I set it on the grass about 20 feet from the porch. I don't know why I did that. I did it, and then I went inside, and then I came back out at dusk and sat on the steps with my coffee. The bread was gone, the apple rings were gone, and the animal was at the tree line, watching me eat the last of my dinner. I held a piece of bread out toward it, not moving, just extending my arm. It didn't come forward. It looked at the bread, and then at my face, and then at the bread again, with what I can only call deliberation, like it was weighing something. Then it went back into the trees, and I heard it moving away up the slope. That unhurried bipedal sound like a large person walking carefully in the brush. I put more food out the next evening, and the one after that, and on the 4th evening it came out of the trees and crossed the grass and took the food from the ground about 10 feet in front of me while I sat very still on the porch steps, and when it looked up at me from the ground with a piece of dried apple in one hand, I said quietly, "It's all right. You're all right." I'm aware of how this sounds. I want to say that plainly. I'm a practical, unsentimental woman, or I thought I was. I had watched my son's casket go into the ground in October in the Stevenson Cemetery next to his grandfather, and I had not been able to cry since because I had used all of it up at the funeral, and what was left was just a hard, gray flatness where the feeling had been. And here was this animal coming across my yard to take food from my hand. And when I said, "You're all right," I was talking to myself as much as anything. I know that. I knew it then. In those first weeks of May, the visits settled into something with a shape I could recognize. Not a routine, exactly, because the animal didn't come every night and didn't come at the same time. But there was a quality of intention to it that I started to understand. When it was going to come, Vashon knew before I did. She'd lift her head from wherever she was resting and orient toward the back of the property, and there would be a change in the room, a slight drop in temperature at the window, the smell arriving a minute or 2 before the animal itself. I learned to pay attention to those signals. I'd put fresh food out on the stump by the back fence. I'd moved the food from the grass to the stump sometime in the 3rd week, because the stump was more visible from the tree line, and I'd sit on the back steps in the dark and wait. What I noticed in those early weeks was how much time it spent watching before it committed to anything. It would be in the tree line for 10-15 minutes before it moved into the clearing. Not frozen, not hiding, moving quietly in the brush, circling slightly, checking something I couldn't identify. Wind direction, maybe. my position, whether I'd moved since it last checked. I'd sit still and keep my coffee cup in my hands and look just slightly past it, not directly at it, because I'd noticed it was more comfortable when I wasn't staring straight at it. That's a thing that's true of most animals. Direct eye contact is a challenge or a threat. Looking past, looking beside, looking away, those communicate something closer to neutrality. I'd spent enough time around deer at close range to know that much. By the end of May, it was coming to the back porch every evening. Not every night, maybe 4 nights out of 7. It ate what I left out, which was mostly table scraps. It was not a picky eater. Bread, cooked vegetables, raw vegetables, apple rings, once a whole baked potato that it held in both hands like a grapefruit and ate in 2 bites. It would not eat meat. I tested that once with a chicken neck, and it sniffed it and turned it over twice and then set it down and looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as politely declining. It ate berries. I had a patch of wild huckleberries coming in along the south fence, and it picked those clean before I could get to them all summer, which annoyed me genuinely and made me laugh out loud alone in my yard when I found the picked stems, which was the first time I had laughed in 8 months. I thought about that later, a lot. The first thing that made me laugh. I named it Bramble. That's going to sound either sentimental or delusional, and I've made my peace with that. It came from the huckleberry patch, and the huckleberries grow in among the salal and the trailing blackberry, and the whole tangled mass of it is what people call bramble. And the name came to me one evening, watching it work through the berry patch with a focus and patience that was entirely its own, and it stuck. I want to be careful here about what I'm saying Bramble was and wasn't. I am not saying it was a child. I am not saying it was a pet. Those are both wrong. It was an animal, of a kind I had no framework for, and I had a responsibility to it the way you have a responsibility to any creature that comes to depend on you. And that responsibility was complicated from the first day by the knowledge that somewhere above my property, in the timber along the Wind River drainage, there were other animals like it, and at some point the question of whether and how it would go back to them was one I was going to have to answer. I made plaster casts of 2 of its prints in mid-May. I'd bought plaster of Paris at the hardware store in Stevenson without quite deciding why, and it sat in the mudroom for 2 weeks before I used it. The prints I cast were from a set in the soft ground near the salal bed, right and left foot, each one clear and deep enough to show the toe spread and the heel impression. I followed the instructions I remembered from Dale's grade school project about animal tracks. Mix to the consistency of thick pancake batter. Pour gently from the edge so you don't disturb the surface. Let it set for 30 minutes, minimum. Both casts came out clean. The right foot cast measured 14 inches long by 6 inches at the widest point of the ball. The mid-tarsal area, the middle third of the foot, showed a slight raised ridge of displaced soil on both sides, as if the foot had flexed at the midpoint of the stride and pressed outward. I didn't know what that meant at the time. I learned later. That summer I learned things about Bramble. Some of them I am still thinking about. It was extremely observant. That's the first thing. It watched me do things, fill the hen, water her, split wood, work in the garden, with the focused attention of something that was learning rather than just watching. This was not the glancing attention of a deer at the edge of a yard. This was sustained, the kind where you can feel yourself being studied the way you feel it from another person. The second week of June, I watched it. from the kitchen window, take a piece of firewood from the woodpile, carry it to a stump I used as a splitting block, and set it on the stump. It looked at the piece of wood for a while. Then it pushed it off the stump and carried it back to the pile and stacked it in more or less the correct orientation. It had watched me move wood from the pile to the splitting block to the stack so many times that it had understood the sequence, or enough of the sequence, to reproduce it. That stopped me cold. I stood at the kitchen window with my coffee going cold in my hand, and I thought, what am I dealing with here? The third week of June, it did something that I've thought about more than almost anything else from that whole summer. I had been working on the south fence, replacing a section where the bottom rail had rotted through. I dug the new post hole and set the post, and I was tamping the soil around it with a fence post tamper, a long steel bar with a weighted cylinder on the end that you lift and drop repeatedly until the soil compacts around the post. Repetitive work, the kind where your arms go on autopilot. I'd been at it for 20 minutes and my shoulders were burning, and I set the tamper against the new post and went to get a drink of water from the jug I'd left on the porch. When I came back, Bramble was at the post. It had picked up the tamper, and it was using it. Not expertly, not efficiently. The bar was heavy for it, and the cylinder swung a little sideways on each lift. But the motion was correct. Lift and drop. Lift and drop. Centered over the disturbed soil around the post base. It did this 4 or 5 times while I stood at the edge of the cleared area with my water jug and watched. Then it set the tamper down against the post, exactly where I'd left it, and looked at me. I said, "Thank you," out loud. I know how that sounds, and I don't care. It looked at me for a moment and then went to the huckleberry patch. I finished the post and walked over to check it, and the soil around the base was noticeably more settled than the other new posts I'd set that week. The tamping had made a difference. Whatever Bramble had done with that bar, it had done it correctly enough to be useful. I stood there with my hand on the post, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 8 months. Not happiness, exactly. More like the specific feeling you get when you realize you are not as alone as you thought you were. There was another incident in July that I haven't mentioned yet and that I'm including now because it's the kind of detail that I think tells you more than the large dramatic moments do. I had a habit of sitting on the back steps in the evenings after dinner with whatever book I was reading at the time. That summer, I was working through a collection of Pacific Northwest natural history essays that I'd had on the shelf for years without reading. I'd take my coffee and a book and sit on the second step and read until the light got too low, which in July in the Columbia River Gorge country is well past 8 o'clock. Bramble, by mid-July, was comfortable enough to be in the clearing while I was on the steps, not close to me, but in the same space, 10, 15 feet. It would be doing whatever it was doing, picking through the grass, watching the tree line, sitting still, and I'd be reading. Normal evenings, or what had become my version of normal. One of those evenings I was reading a passage about elk migration patterns in the Cascades, and I read a sentence out loud without thinking about it. Not to Bramble, just out loud to myself, the way you do when something strikes you as interesting. Something about how elk herds in the southern Cascades shift their range by as much as 12 miles between seasons in response to snowpack depth. I looked up and Bramble had stopped what it was doing and was looking directly at me. Not the peripheral attention it usually paid when I moved or made noise. Full attention, eyes on my face. I held the book up toward it without really thinking about what I was doing. A gesture. "Here," I said. Bramble looked at the book. Then it looked at my face. Then it looked at the book again. Then it came 3 steps closer than it had ever come to me voluntarily, and sat down in the grass and looked at the book in my hand with the same focused attention it had given the raven in late July. I kept reading, out loud. Not the whole passage, just a paragraph or 2 about the snowpack data and the correlation with calving grounds. When I stopped, Bramble kept looking at the book for a moment, and then looked at my face, and I had the clear and unmistakable sensation. I'm not overclaiming this. I'm saying it was a sensation, not a certainty, that it was waiting for me to continue. I read 2 more pages out loud. Then the light got too low, and I said, "That's all for tonight," and went inside. When I looked back from the door, Bramble was still sitting in the grass where it had settled, looking at the spot where I'd been. I read out loud every evening for the rest of the summer, not always from the natural history book, whatever I happened to be reading. I read from a biography of a woman who had homesteaded in eastern Washington in the 1890s. I read from a book about tides and how the gravitational mechanics of the moon affect them, which I'd found in the donation pile at the library. I read once from the Psalms, which was a Sunday school habit I'd never fully given up. Bramble listened with that particular attention and made the low humming sound sometimes while I read, which I came to understand as something like engagement, a sound it made when something was holding its interest. It made the same sound when it was working through the huckleberry patch efficiently. It made the same sound when it was at the top of the Douglas fir, looking at whatever it was looking at from up there. I'm not telling you that Bramble understood the content of what I read. I don't believe that. I'm telling you that it was interested in the experience of language as a phenomenon, in the rhythm and cadence of it, in the way I changed inflection when the text shifted tone, in the fact that this sound I was making was structured and patterned and different from any other sound a human makes. Whether that interest was aesthetic or cognitive or something else entirely, I have no way to know. What I know is that by August, if I came out to the steps without a book, Bramble would look at my empty hands and look at the door and make a sound I hadn't heard it make before. Not the low hum, something more like a question. I started bringing a book every time. There was a morning in late June when I came out to the garden and found it had been in the vegetable beds overnight. Now the first instinct is to be upset about that, and I was, briefly. 3 rows of my snap beans had been gone through, and the beans that were ready had been pulled off the vine. The ones that weren't ready had been left alone. Not one immature bean had been taken. Whatever had gone through the garden had known the difference between a bean that was ready and one that wasn't, which is not a simple determination. You have to handle the pod, feel for the right firmness and fullness, and check the length. A mature snap bean in a June garden is 5 or 6 inches long and full, but not bulging. The ones that had been taken were exactly that. The ones left behind were under 4 inches, still filling out. Every time I bent down to check the vines that were left, the assessment was correct. Nothing immature, nothing wasted. I stood in the bean rows for a while with my hands on my knees, and then I went inside, and I did not say anything about it to anyone. But that night I doubled the amount of vegetables I put out on the stump. Something changed in July in how Bramble moved. It was growing fast, the way juvenile animals grow fast, in a season when food is reliable, and the growth was changing its proportions. The head was still large relative to the body, but the body was filling in. The arms were lengthening, and the way it used its body in space was becoming more deliberate, more planned. Early on, when it moved around the clearing, there was a quality of improvisation to it. That particular quality you see in young animals figuring out where their feet are. By July, that was gone. It moved the way an athlete moves, with economy and precision, putting its weight exactly where it intended each time. There was an incident in early July that I should include here because I think it demonstrates something important about how Bramble's mind worked. I had been out at the woodpile in the late afternoon, splitting rounds for the next winter's supply. I use a splitting maul, a 6-pound head on a 30-inch handle. And I'm not a small woman, but that maul gets heavy after an hour, and I'd been at it since 3. I was tired, and I misjudged a knot in a round of big-leaf maple, and the maul glanced off and caught my left forearm on the swing back. Not badly. I didn't break anything. But the bruise that came up was impressive, and my arm was sore enough that I quit splitting and went inside. Bramble was at the edge of the clearing when this happened. It had been watching me split, which it often did in the late afternoons. When the maul glanced and I grabbed my arm, it moved. Not fast, not panicked, just forward. It came out of the clearing toward me, closed about half the distance between us, and stopped. It looked at my arm, then it looked at my face. It held that position for maybe a minute, just looking, and then it went back to where it had been. I don't know what to make of that, and I'm not going to overclaim what it means. What I can say is that the movement was responsive, and that it stopped at a distance that felt calibrated, close enough to make its presence felt, not so close as to crowd me. It was checking on me. I believe that without reservation. Whether that constitutes concern in any meaningful sense, whether what it experienced was analogous to anything a person would call worry, I don't know, and I'm not going to pretend I do. What I know is that something in the pattern of my movement changed, and the animal's behavior changed in response, and the response was oriented toward me rather than away from me. It climbed. I should have mentioned that earlier, and I'm sorry. It could go up a Douglas fir about the way a good climber goes up a telephone pole. Both arms and both legs working, not slow, moving in sections. The firs on my property were 60 to 70 feet. I watched it go to the top of one of the tallest on an August morning, all the way to where the trunk starts to thin and sway, and sit up there for the better part of an hour. I have no idea what it was looking at. The Cascades in August are clear enough that from the top of a 70-foot tree you'd see a long way, all the way to Mount Adams if the direction was right. It sat up there with the wind moving the top of the tree, and it looked out at whatever it was looking at, and then it came down and went about its business. I thought about that for days, what it was thinking about, looking out from up there, whether it was looking for something, whether it was oriented somehow to country I couldn't see from the ground. Later in July, I started to notice something about the way it interacted with the property beyond just the clearing and the stump. It had a circuit. In the mornings, usually before I was out of bed, it moved through the property in a pattern I eventually mapped in my composition notebook. Northeast corner first. The tilted fence post was always its entry point. Then along the back fence toward the huckleberry patch. Then to the woodpile, where it would sometimes pick up a piece of wood and turn it over and set it down. Then to the hen pen, where it would stand outside the wire and look in. The hens had stopped being alarmed by it sometime in June. They'd bunch at the far end of the pen when it came near. but they didn't scatter to the trees anymore. Then back across the clearing to the northeast corner and out. I know this because I watched it from the kitchen window on the mornings when I was up early enough. I kept a log. That's the kind of person I am, apparently. The kind who, when an unknown primate juvenile adopts her property, starts keeping a behavioral log in the back of her dead son's hunting journal. The entries are still there. I won't read them here because some of them are not about Bramble, they're about Dale, and those are mine. By August, Bramble was roughly the size of a large German shepherd when it was moving on all fours, which it did about half the time, and when it stood up, which it did to look over the fence, or to look into the tree line, or sometimes just standing in the clearing doing what looked for all the world like nothing. It came to about my chin. I am 5'4", so call it 5 foot. And it was still growing. I could see it changing week to week. The shoulders were broadening, the arms were lengthening, the face was losing the roundness of the young animal it had been in April and taking on the heavier structure that characterizes the adults in the few accounts I'd started to collect. I had started reading. I want to explain how that happened, because I was not a person who would have sought this out on my own. In early July, I was at the Skamania County Library in Stevenson. I went there once a week, and I was picking up holds, and the librarian, a woman named Darlene Frost, who'd been at that desk since before I moved to the county, said to me out of nowhere, "You look better, Ruth." And I said I felt better, which was true, and which surprised me when I heard myself say it. And Darlene said, "What changed?" And I didn't have an answer that I was willing to give her, so I said I'd been sleeping more, which was also true. And then she said, "You know, I'm not one for this kind of thing, but we just got a donation of some books from a retired Forest Service man in Husum, and some of them are..." She made a gesture with her hand, a turning gesture, like something ambiguous. Unusual. And she showed me a stack of about 12 books that were in the process of being catalogued. I looked at them. Most were books on Pacific Northwest natural history, field guides, that kind of thing. But 3 of them were about what the retired Forest Service man apparently spent his career thinking about. One was a collection of first-person accounts that had been gathered in the 1970s by a man named Peter Byrne, who ran something called the Bigfoot Information Center out of the Dalles, Oregon. One was an analysis of track evidence by a researcher named Grover Krantz, who was a physical anthropologist at Washington State University. The third was a thin, self-published thing by a man in Port Angeles, with a hand-drawn cover that I can't remember the name of, but that had in it some of the most careful, direct observation writing I have ever read. I checked all 3 out. I read them in order of thickness, shortest to longest, which is my habit, and what I found in all 3 was the same basic recognition. The thing at the edge of my property was described in these pages. Not just the broad outlines of it, the specifics, the musk with the warm undertone, the bipedalism combined with knuckle walking, the deliberate observational quality, the comfort with human proximity once trust was established, the diet, which multiple accounts identified as heavily plant-based with a particular interest in berries and roots, the speed and silence of movement in timber. The Krantz book was the most useful to me because Krantz was a scientist, and he wrote like one. He had spent years analyzing track evidence, and he made an argument that I found compelling. Not because I needed persuading, I was already persuaded, but because it gave me a vocabulary for what I was seeing. the mid-tarsal pressure ridge in Sasquatch tracks, which is a specific feature that appears about a third of the way back on the foot and indicates a flexible midfoot joint rather than a rigid arch. Human feet have rigid arches. This creature's feet do not. Was something Krantz argued could not be faked with a carved wooden foot, because the pressure dynamics of a fake print would not replicate the organic distortion pattern of a real foot moving through soil. I went and looked at the prints I'd made plaster casts of in May, and there it was, a clear ridge of soil compression about a third of the way back from the toes, where the midfoot had flexed and then extended, pushing soil forward and to the sides in a pattern that no carved wooden foot pressed straight down would produce. That ridge meant a real foot, a real animal. I already knew that, but it was something to have a framework for why I knew it. I also found, in the Byrne accounts, references to juvenile encounters. They were rare. He had 6 or 8 reports that he considered reasonably credible, spread across 30 years of collecting, and in all of them the pattern was similar. An animal smaller than the adults, less cautious, showing up in places the adults typically avoided, disappearing after a period of weeks or months. In 2 of the accounts, the juvenile was described as appearing after a period of unusual activity. A winter, with heavy avalanche or slide conditions in the local mountains. I read those accounts 3 times. I thought about the slide on Forest Road 30 in February. I thought about the mudslide damage I'd seen described in the Skamania County Pioneer in March. I thought about the smell that had hit me at the fence post in April, coming from an animal that was small enough to sit in my ferns with its knees up and its arms folded across them and look at me like it was waiting for me to do something useful. One of the accounts in Byrne's collection that I kept returning to was from a woman in Cowlitz County, Washington, which is the county just north of Skamania, who described a similar situation in the mid-1960s. She was a rancher's wife on a property along the Toutle River, and she described a period of about 4 months in which a juvenile animal came repeatedly to the edge of her property and eventually to her garden. Her account was notable for 2 things. First, she described the juvenile as showing what she called teaching behavior, watching her and her husband do tasks, and then attempting to reproduce the tasks on its own in the hours after they'd gone inside. She'd found tools moved, a garden hoe that left in a different position, a small pile of stones stacked near the garden wall that she hadn't stacked. Second, she described the smell in exactly the terms I would have used. Deep musk with a sweet undertone, something she said reminded her of a fermenting fruit smell, warm in a way that didn't make sense given the cool weather. She said she had never smelled anything like it before and had never smelled anything like it since. The account had been taken down by Byrne in 1971, 6 or 7 years after it had occurred, and she had asked that her name not be used. Byrne identified her only as a Cowlitz County rancher's wife, approximately 50 years of age, credible. I thought about her a lot. I still do. She saw something on the Toutle River in the 1960s, and she told someone about it 20 years before. I found myself in the same situation, and the details were close enough to mine that reading her account felt like reading a letter from a stranger who had been in the same house. The Toutle River and the Wind River drain different sides of the southern Cascades. The Toutle runs west off the slopes of Mount St. Helens. The Wind runs south off the Cascades, east of the Spirit Lake country. But the country between them is connected. It's national forest and wilderness land, roadless in the interior sections, with ridge lines that run continuously for 30 miles without a maintained crossing. An animal, or a group of animals, could move between those drainages without ever crossing a road. I think about that geography sometimes. I think about the range these animals must have to maintain, the distances they must cover, the country they must know in a way no map can represent. A 50-square-mile range is a conservative estimate, as I said. Some of what I've read since suggests the actual range of a group may be considerably larger, particularly in a year when food is scarce or when disruption has displaced them from a section of their usual territory. I returned the library books in August and didn't check them out again because I didn't need to. But I remembered Grover Krantz's name, and the following spring I wrote him a letter at Washington State University. I didn't describe my specific situation. I wasn't ready for that. But I asked some general questions about juvenile behavior and about what was known about family group structure in Pacific Northwest accounts. He wrote back a short, careful reply. He said that juvenile accounts were rare in the literature because juveniles were presumably kept at a distance from human activity by the adults in the group. He said the few accounts that did describe juveniles consistently noted the same things: smaller size, lighter coloring in some cases, and a behavioral quality that he described as exploratory rather than avoidant. He said that in his opinion, the adult group structure appeared to be kin-based, meaning that adults would maintain contact with and eventually retrieve a juvenile that had separated from the group, provided the juvenile was findable. He used the word findable, and he underlined it. I sat with that word for a long time. I want to tell you about one more thing that happened that summer, because I think it is the most important observation I made, and I have never heard anyone else describe it quite this way. It was a Saturday afternoon in late July, one of those high-pressure days that come to the Cascades in summer, when the sky is so blue it looks painted, and the temperature gets into the 80s, and the timber smells like resin and hot needles. I was in the garden, weeding the onion bed, which is the most tedious job in a kitchen garden, and the one I put off longest. Bramble was in the clearing, which had become its usual afternoon position, at or near the stump, sometimes in the huckleberry patch, sometimes just sitting in the grass, doing what appeared to be nothing. On this particular afternoon, it was sitting in the grass, watching a raven that had landed on the top rail of the old fence along the west side of the property. Ravens are common in that country, smart birds. They'll watch you work a garden for 20 minutes trying to figure out if anything you turn up is worth eating. This raven was watching me. Bramble was watching the raven. After a while, the raven made a sound. That hollow, woody clunk they make, not the caw, but the deeper one. And Bramble made a sound back. Not the same sound, but a sound. The raven tilted its head. Bramble made the sound again. The raven made a different sound and hopped sideways on the rail. Bramble made yet another sound, higher this time. I stopped weeding and watched this go on for probably 4 minutes. The raven and the animal in my yard were exchanging sounds in a pattern that had the rhythm of a conversation, not the rhythm of two animals making noise in proximity. I cannot make a stronger claim than that. I cannot say they were communicating in any meaningful way, but the alternating, responsive, patterned quality of it was not random. Each sound seemed to prompt the next. The raven eventually flew off toward the tree line, and Bramble watched it go and then went back to whatever it had been doing before. I finished the onion bed and went inside and stood at the sink washing my hands, and I thought, that animal is curious about things. Not just wary of them, not just tolerant of them. Curious. It wanted to know what the raven was doing, and it tried to engage with it. It was interested in the world in the way that an intelligence is interested in the world. And I thought, that changes things. Curiosity is not an animal instinct. Hunger is an animal instinct. Territory is an animal instinct. Curiosity is something else. Curiosity is what you have when you have enough of everything else and you turn to what you don't understand yet, and you decide to understand it. I thought about that a lot in the months after Bramble left. I thought about what it meant that an animal, a being, I started using that word to myself somewhere in August, could sit in my garden on a hot July afternoon and try to talk to a raven. I thought about what else it might be curious about. I thought about whether it was curious about me, and what it had made of what it saw when it watched me all those months. If it was trying to understand me the way I was trying to understand it, then we were both going about it in the same way, patiently, from a distance, paying attention to what the other one did when it thought no one was watching. I find that thought moving, and I'm not going to apologize for finding it moving. August was the fullest month. Bramble came almost every day, sometimes in the morning and once in the afternoon, and again at dusk. The huckleberries were in heavy that summer. The late spring rain had been good for them, and it worked through the patch methodically, picking with both hands, eating as it went. I put out supplemental food on the stump, but by August, it wasn't relying on the stump the way it had in May and June. It had figured out the land well enough to be finding food on its own, coming to me in the evenings more, I think, for the company than the calories. I know that's a large thing to say about a wild animal. I know it's exactly the kind of thing a lonely woman alone on a 14-acre property would project onto the nearest warm-blooded creature that paid her any attention. I've sat with that possibility for 30 years, and I've never been able to fully dismiss it. But I've also never been able to dismiss what I observed. By August, Bramble would sit within 6 feet of the porch steps while I was on them. It would be on one side of an invisible line, and I would be on the other, and we'd both sit in the evening dark and listen to the creek and the wind and the last of the summer birds, and it would make the low humming sound, and I'd sometimes talk about Dale, about the garden, about nothing in particular. And it would look at me while I talked with an attention I can only describe as genuine, not the fixed stare of a predator, not the skittish tracking of a prey animal. Something that was listening. I was not ignoring what this meant. I want to be clear about that. I knew that I had a situation that was going to resolve in a way I didn't control, and I knew it was going to resolve by Bramble choosing something other than my backyard. That was the correct outcome. I understood that. I thought about it in the rational part of my mind, and knew it was right, and felt something different in the part of my chest where Dale lived. And I kept those two things separate as well as I could, and kept feeding the huckleberry patch with the compost I'd been saving, and kept my porch light on at night. In September, the smell changed. That first smell I'd found in April, the musk and the warm sweetness, was still there, but there was something added to it, something more complex, harder to describe, older, maybe, like something that had been in the earth for a long time, was now in the air. I noticed it for the first time on a night in early September, when the air was cooling and the salal berries were ripening and I was on the porch with my after-dinner coffee. It was coming from the tree line above the property, not from Bramble, who was in the clearing picking at the last of the huckleberries. When that smell hit the air, Bramble stopped, just stopped, berry in hand, head up, and made a sound I had not heard before. Not the low hum I knew, something higher and more urgent. 2 notes, the second one dropping, like a question, no answer from the trees. Bramble made the sound again, still nothing. After a minute it went back to the berries, but there was a quality to how it moved for the rest of the evening that I can only call agitation. It didn't settle. It kept looking at the tree line. It didn't stay as long as it usually did, and when it left that night it went faster than usual up the slope. Not the leisurely, unhurried movement I'd come to know, but something with purpose. I went to sleep that night with the window open, which I'd started doing in August, because the nights were warm and because I'd found that I slept better with the sounds of the property coming in. Around 1 in the morning I woke up to wood knocks. I'd heard that term before. I'd read enough by then to know it was a reported behavior, things striking trees in a pattern. But I had not heard it in person, and I was not prepared for how different it sounded from anything I might have expected. It was not the sound of a branch falling or a tree snapping in the wind. It was the sound of something hard hitting something hard, rhythmic and deliberate, with a gap between strikes that was the same gap every time, like someone hitting a fence post with a bat. 2 strikes, pause. 2 strikes, pause. Coming from the slope above the property, maybe 200 yards up the drainage, carrying cleanly in the cold night air. Then, from further away and to the left, an answer. 3 strikes, the same cadence, different depth to the sound. 2 animals, talking. Vashon was awake beside me. She was not alarmed. Her breathing was the slow, steady breathing of a dog who is paying attention but is not afraid. I lay still and listened to the knocks for maybe 4 minutes, and then they stopped and the forest was quiet. In the morning I went up the slope above the property boundary. I'd been up there before. It's national forest land, but there's no sign, no fence, nothing marking the boundary, just the land continuing. The ground was soft and mossy, old duff 3 or 4 inches deep, the kind of moss that holds a print the way a wax mold does. I found them about 150 yards above my fence line. Adult prints, large ones. The right foot was 18 inches long. I measured it with the tape I'd brought. And the stride was between 60 and 65 inches. 2 sets of them, maybe 15 feet apart, laterally, like 2 animals had been walking parallel to each other across the slope. They came from the north and went south and disappeared onto a rocky section where the basalt came through the duff, and prints don't take. The depth of those prints, more than 1 inch in the wet moss, in places 1.25 inches. That is not a small animal. That is something with considerable weight behind each step. I measured my own boot print in the same section of moss, and it came to 1/4 inch. That gap is not explainable by a person in a costume. You cannot fake weight the way you can fake size. I stood up there for a while with the tape measure in my hand, and the morning light coming through the fir canopy, and I thought about what it meant that adults had been in the timber above my property, and I thought about the smell that had changed in September, and I thought about the sound Bramble had made when it hit the air. They were looking for it. I believe that. I think the timing of the mudslide and whatever disruption happened in April had delayed the search. Or maybe they hadn't known for months where to look. Or maybe it had taken this long for a young animal on its own to produce a smell that carried far enough for them to follow. I don't know how their society works. I don't know if society is even the right word. But the prints and the knocks and the timing were consistent with one explanation. they had found where it was. I went home and put more huckleberries out on the stump. Bramble came that evening and ate them and sat in the clearing and made the two-note sound twice while it was there. No answer, no smell on the air. Whatever had been above my property the night before was gone or downwind. Over the next 3 weeks of September, the pattern of the knocks changed. They came more frequently. Not every night, but 4 nights out of 7, which was more than the occasional single occurrence I'd had at the start of the month. And they varied. Sometimes it was the 2-strike pattern from the first night. Sometimes it was a single hard strike, silence, then 2 more. Once I heard a vocalization between the knock sequences, not the 2-note sound Bramble used, something lower and longer, almost resonant, the way a call travels when it's meant to carry distance. It went on for about 40 seconds, and I lay in my bed with my eyes open and the darkness, and I thought about range, about how far a sound like that carries in still fall air on a drainage where the trees redirect the wind upslope. I thought about how many miles of timber were above my property, between the fence and whatever country these animals used when they weren't near me. I thought about what it means to search for something in that much country. What I did in those September weeks, I'm not proud of in retrospect. I started going out at night, not far, just to the northeast corner of the property, to the tilted fence post, and standing there for 20 minutes or half an hour with my flashlight off, listening. I don't know what I thought I was going to accomplish. If the adults were in the timber above me, my going out in the dark was not going to reassure them that I was safe to approach. More likely the opposite. But I needed to be outside and close to whatever was happening up the slope, in the same way you need to be near the hospital when someone is in it, even if there's nothing you can do there. I heard things in those nights that I haven't described yet because I've been trying to figure out how to describe them accurately, and I still haven't fully managed it. The first was on a Saturday night in the 2nd week of September, 11 o'clock, cold enough that I could see my breath. I was at the fence post, flashlight in my coat pocket, listening to the timber. The wood knocks had been going earlier in the evening and had stopped around 9:30. After that, quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight. I was about to go in when I heard something that I can only describe as movement that was too controlled to be wind and too large to be anything I had a name for, not crashing through brush, not the noisy progress of a deer or a bear. Something that moved with deliberate quiet, and that moved a lot of air. I could feel it more than hear it, a displacement, a sense of mass relocating itself in the dark timber, maybe 50 yards above my fence line. Then it stopped. Whatever it was stood still in the timber above me, and I stood still at the fence post below it, and neither of us moved for what I estimated afterward was close to 3 minutes, but which felt much longer. I was not afraid. I want to be clear about that because I think it's relevant to what happened next. I had spent 6 months with one of these animals in my yard. I knew what they smelled like. I knew how they moved. I knew something about how they thought. What I felt standing at that fence post in the September dark was not fear. It was something more like being assessed. Then the smell came down. That deep musk with the warm undertone, the older version of Bramble's smell, the one I'd first noticed when September changed. And it sat in the air around me for about 30 seconds, while whatever was above me held still. Then I heard the movement again, not the careful, controlled movement of before, but faster, going north along the slope, away from my property. In half a minute, it was gone. I stood at the fence post for a while longer, Then I went inside and locked the back door and sat at the kitchen table and wrote in the composition notebook until my hand got tired. The second thing happened on a Tuesday night 3 weeks later. 2 days before the evening, the adults came out of the trees and the eyes were at the tree line. I was asleep when it happened. Vashon woke me at 12:30 with a sound I'd never heard from her. Not her alert whine, not the low questioning sound, something more urgent, a series of short, sharp exhalations that weren't quite barks. I sat up in the dark and listened. The forest outside the open window was as quiet as I've ever heard it. No wind, no creek sound. The drainage went low in October. No birds. Then a sound from maybe 100 yards up the slope, in the timber above the fence. I don't have the right frame for it even now. It was not a knock. It was a vocalization, but not the resonant carrying call I'd heard before. This was closer to a voice. Not words, not language I could parse. But it had inflection, and it had structure, and it moved through registers in a way that reminded me, then and still, of grief. Of what grief sounds like when it's too large for the body that holds it, low and long and not quite sustained. It broke once in the middle and then resumed, and it went on for perhaps 20 seconds, and then stopped. Vashon was pressed against my legs and shaking. Not with fear, exactly. With something that felt more like the response to very loud sound, a physical vibration. I put my hand on her and she settled. We sat there in the dark for another few minutes and there was nothing more. I did not go to the fence post that night. I lay back down and kept my hand on Vashon and listened to the forest come back to itself. First the wind, then the distant creek, then the first owl of the night somewhere in the canopy above the house, and I thought about what that sound had meant. I still think about it. It was in the drainage above my property for a reason that night. Whatever made that sound, and it made it for a reason. Whether it was calling for something it had lost months ago, or whether it was doing something else entirely, I don't know. But I know that the night after that was the last night. Bramble came to the clearing before the final evening, when it walked into the tree line and didn't come back. Bramble heard the vocalizations. I know because twice I was awake when one of them came, and I could hear Bramble from the clearing. It was sleeping near the huckleberry patch by then. At least some nights, I'd found its sleeping press in the tall grass in August. And both times, the vocalization from the slope brought Bramble upright. I could hear the movement in the grass, the change in the night, and then the two-note sound, again and again, until there was no answer, or the night went quiet, and then it settled back down. October came. The vine maples turned, and the mornings got cold, and the hens started laying less, which is what hens do when the light shortens. Dale's anniversary came and went. I went to the cemetery and sat with it for an hour, and came home and found Bramble waiting on the porch steps, which it had never done before. It was sitting on the second step with its arms on its knees, the same posture I'd seen that first evening in the ferns, looking at the door. When I came around the corner of the house, it looked at me, and I sat down on the top step above it, and we sat there together until the dark came down. I don't know what to make of that. I've had 30 years to make something of it, and I haven't managed to. So I'm just going to leave it sitting there the way it happened and let you decide what you think. I'm going to pause here for just a moment. What comes next is the hardest part of the story for me to get through, and I want to make sure I have the sequence right in my head before I go on. It was the 3rd week of October when the knocks came back. not twice in the night this time. They started at dusk and went through the night, 2 sets, from different points in the slope above the property, which I understood from what I'd read meant at least 2 animals up there. Different intervals, different distances, answering each other. I sat at the kitchen window and listened to them until past midnight, and then I went to bed and lay there with the window open, and they continued until maybe 3 in the morning, and then stopped. Bramble did not come that evening. It did not come the next evening. On the 3rd evening it came, but it was different. It ate quickly and without the usual attention. It barely looked at the food, just ate it standing up, and it kept its face turned to the tree line, the 2-note sound, over and over. And this time, from somewhere in the trees, there was an answer, long and low and descending, carrying through the timber the way sound carries through timber, attenuated by the distance but clear. Bramble went still when it heard it, completely still. It made the sound again. The answer came back, closer. I was at the kitchen window. I had not turned the porch light on because I hadn't wanted to disrupt whatever was happening. So the clearing was in the dusk light, and I could see Bramble at the stump and the tree line past it as a dark wall, with the last gray sky behind it. And at the edge of the tree line, 2 lights, low at first, and then rising, eye-shine, amber, the same color as Bramble's but bigger, the way a dog's eyes are bigger than a puppy's eyes in a flashlight beam. 2 pairs of them, wide apart, 8 or 9 feet off the ground when they'd risen to full height. That is not a bear standing up. That is not any animal I have a name for at that height. I could not see the bodies. The dark was too complete at the tree line. Just the eyes, motionless. 2 sets of them, separated by about 30 feet, just inside the trees. Bramble walked toward them. It didn't run. It walked upright, and it was tall enough now that when it reached the tree line and stopped between the 2 sets of eyes, the top of its head was at a height that put it level with the adults. It had grown that much in 6 months. There was a period of time at the tree line that I cannot describe to you in any useful detail because I could not see enough to describe it. I could hear things, sounds I hadn't heard before, complex and low, the kind of vocalizations that have too much structure to be random, but that I had no vocabulary to parse. Not growls, not howls, something that moved through registers the way a conversation moves, one voice and then another and then the first again. Minutes passed, maybe 10, maybe 15. I was not moving. I do not think I was breathing right. Then the eyes were gone, all 6 of them, not moved away into the trees, just gone, the way eyes disappear when an animal turns its head. Between 1 second and the next, the tree line was dark. The clearing was empty. I stood at the kitchen window, and the cold from the glass was on my forehead, where I'd pressed it against the pane, and the property was as quiet as it ever is, which is not entirely quiet. There's always the creak sound from the drainage and the wind moving the firs. And I waited. Nothing came back. I went to bed at 11 and I lay there for a while, and then I got up and went to the back door and opened it. Cold air and the smell of October timber. I stood there with my feet on the cold linoleum and my arms around myself, and I said Dale's name once out loud, which I hadn't done since the funeral. Then I closed the door and went back to bed. In the morning there were prints in the soft ground at the edge of the clearing, 3 sets of adult prints coming from the tree line, 1 set of juvenile prints going to the tree line and not coming back. The adults had walked in a rough semicircle toward the stump where I left the food. I don't know why. I don't know if they were checking the scent or the area or something I have no name for. And then they had gone back to the tree line. The juvenile prince led straight in and stopped at the tree line. Bramble did not come back. I expected that. I want to say I expected it. I had known since September, when that smell changed and the knocks started, that the situation was going to resolve this way, and I had had time to prepare myself for it. And it was the right thing. A wild animal belongs with its kind. I knew that. I knew it with the same certainty you know anything that is obviously true. What I was not prepared for was the absence. I had spent 6 months in the company of something that was entirely itself, that had no concept of what I was going through or what I had lost, that just came across my yard in the evenings and took food and sat in my clearing and learned things from watching me. And the absence of it was a particular kind of emptiness that was different from the emptiness Dale had left. Dale's absence was a hole where something enormous had been. This was smaller, but it was mine, in a way I hadn't expected. The winter after Bramble left was the hardest winter I had had since the year Dale died, but it was a different kind of hard. In the winter after Dale, the hardness was absence, the absolute removal of something that had been there, the negative space where a person had been. This winter was different. This was the hardness of having had something and knowing it was correctly gone, and sitting with the fact that correct and easy are not the same thing. I kept the porch light on through November and into December. Not because I expected anything to come back, but because the light itself was a form of maintenance, of keeping the space ready. I fed the hens. I split wood. I went to Stevenson on Thursdays. I ate regular meals for the first time in over a year, which I noticed and was mildly surprised by. I put fresh cornbread out on the stump the Thursday after Thanksgiving, which was not a logical thing to do, and which I cannot explain, except that it felt right. My neighbor to the east, a man named Earl Gunderson, who ran about 30 head of cattle on a mix of his own land and a Forest Service grazing allotment, came by in December to ask if I'd had any issues with my fence line on the north end of the property. He'd found some unusual track sign in the drainage between our properties. He described it carefully, the way careful men describe things. Something bipedal, larger than a person, track depth he couldn't account for. He wasn't asking me to confirm what he thought it was. He was a practical man who had lived in Skamania County his whole life, and he was asking me, neighbor to neighbor, whether I'd had any fence problems or livestock issues tied to whatever had been moving through that drainage. I told him I hadn't had livestock issues, which was true. I did not tell him anything else. He nodded and said he hadn't had any either, which struck him as strange. He'd had coyote problems for years, and that fall the coyote sign had gone away from his allotment entirely, which he couldn't account for. He drove back home, and I stood at the edge of my property, watching his truck go, and thought about what he'd said. Coyotes avoid the places these animals use. I'd read that in one of the burn accounts and dismissed it as anecdote. Earl Gunderson was not a man who made things up. Earl came back in February with a different question. He'd been up on the Gunderson Creek drainage, a tributary of the Wind River that cut through the back of his allotment, checking on a salt lick he kept up there for the cattle, and he'd found something. He described it as a structure, he said, which was not a word I'd expected from Earl. Sticks, he said, like someone had built something with sticks, big sticks, not twigs. He'd kicked it apart before he really looked at it, which he seemed to regret. He said it was maybe 4 feet across, and it was in a place where there was no reason for a person to build anything, half a mile from the nearest road on a slope above the creek, that you couldn't get a vehicle to. He wanted to know if I'd ever seen anything like that. I said I hadn't, which was not quite true, but was close enough that I could live with it. He looked at me for a moment with the look that a man who has known you for 15 years gives you when he thinks you're not being straight with him. Then he got in his truck and drove home. After he left, I went out to the northeast corner of my property and looked at the tilted fence post for a long time. Then I went inside and wrote in the composition notebook for the first time since October. The day after Bramble left, I had gone around the property looking at everything carefully, looking at what was different since April. The bean rows that had been carefully harvested, the huckleberry patch, now bare of fruit, the stump that still had a faint oily smell on it, that musk and warmth that I had learned to associate with these animals, the northeast fence post, still tilted from the frost heaves. I walked the property boundary all the way around, the full 45 minutes, and I paid attention to everything, the way you pay attention to a house when someone has just moved out of it. Checking what's changed, checking what the absence looks like now that it is an absence. I found something at the northeast corner, at the tilted fence post, sitting in the fork of a vine maple just above the post, where it would have been easy to miss. A structure made of sticks, not a pile. A structure. Interlocked branches arranged into a rough lattice maybe 18 inches across, with 4 smaller sticks placed across the center in a rough X shape. I picked it up carefully. The branches were freshly broken, still with a little give in them. Whatever had built it recently. I don't know what it was. I have read about stick structures in the years since, and there are accounts of them in Pacific Northwest Sasquatch literature going back decades, usually described as markers or gifts or something between the two. I don't know what this one was meant to be. I know it was in the specific spot where Bramble had first come into my property, at the exact fence post where Vashon had first stopped and sat down in April. I know it was built after Bramble left, because I had walked that corner 2 days before, and it wasn't there. And I know that when I held it, the branches were still warm from whatever hands had made it. I kept it. It's in the mudroom, in the same box as the plaster casts. I did not tell anyone that winter. I kept the prints. I'd cast 2 of Bramble's early prints with plaster of Paris in May, the way you do for fossils, and they were in the box on the shelf in the mudroom. I kept the huckleberry patch cleared. I kept the porch light on. In December, I got a letter from a man named Gene Osmer, who said he was a wildlife researcher at Washington State University who had heard through channels. He didn't specify what channels. That someone in Skamania County had been reporting unusual activity on their property. He asked if he could come and talk to me. I did not respond to the letter. I don't know who he heard it from, since I hadn't told anyone, and I've thought about that a lot over the years. I suspect the answer has to do with the fact that Skamania County had passed an ordinance in the 1960s making it a gross misdemeanor to kill a Sasquatch within county limits. They were serious enough about the subject to put it in the code, the only county in the country to do so. And there are people in the county who pay attention to that kind of thing and talk to each other quietly. I suspect someone had been up the county road and found prints before I got to them. But I don't know. Osmer wrote again in January. This letter was longer and more specific. He said he was particularly interested in any evidence of juvenile activity in the area, which was a phrase that made me set the letter down and look at it from across the kitchen table for a while before I picked it back up. He said he had been compiling reports from Skamania and Klickitat counties for several years, and that the pattern of activity in this part of the Wind River corridor was of particular research interest. He included a return address and a phone number at the university. He said he understood if I wasn't comfortable speaking about it, but that anything I could share would be held in confidence. I kept that letter for 2 years before I threw it away. I never answered it, and I don't regret that decision. But I've thought about it since. If Osmer knew about juvenile activity in this corridor, he had either gathered enough other reports to infer it, or someone had talked to him who knew something. That's a small universe of people. I've narrowed it to 2 possibilities. Earl Gunderson, who wouldn't have said anything to an academic he didn't know, or someone who had been in the timber above my property and seen something they subsequently reported. The latter seems more likely. Those drainage roads attract people in summer. Mushroom pickers, berry pickers, the occasional searcher for privacy of one kind or another. Someone could have seen prints without knowing what they were, and passed the information on through channels I can't trace. What I know is that the following spring, in April of 1990, exactly 1 year from when it started, the smell was back. Just one morning, for 2 days. Then gone. I believe that was bramble. I can't prove it. It was larger. The prints I found were a full adult stride and depth, not the smaller prints I'd measured the previous year. Whatever came near my property in April of 1990 weighed more than I do, and had a stride I couldn't have paced out without running. But the smell had that particular warm sweetness that I'd associated with the animal from my own yard, under the musk. And it came from the northeast, which is the direction bramble had always come from, and it went to the huckleberry patch, which had no ripe berries in April. And it stood there for a while, and then left. I like to think it came back to check on me. I know that's projection, and I don't care. I keep the huckleberry patch cleared. I put berries out on the stump in October, on the anniversary, the way you leave flowers at a grave. Not because I think it does anything, because I want to. Because 6 months in the company of something that is wholly itself, and asks nothing from you except the continued existence of food on a stump is not nothing, and maintaining the ritual of it is my way of acknowledging that. The years after were quieter, in terms of direct encounter, but not empty. In 1991, I found a set of adult prints in the creek bottom below the east fence which I wouldn't have found at all if I hadn't been down there fixing a section of the bank where the high water had cut in. The prints were in the clay at the water's edge, 3 of them, the right foot clearly showing, and they were the largest I'd found, 19 inches, the tip of my tape measure to the first mark above my wrist. I filled those in before I left. I don't know why. Habit, maybe. An instinct toward protecting something that had protected me without knowing it was doing it. In 1993, I started sleeping with the bedroom window open year-round, which I'd never done before bramble. The cold doesn't bother me the way it used to. I told Marge Pettibone from the Methodist when she asked about it that I'd always been a hot sleeper, which is also partially true. But the real reason is that I sleep better when the air coming in smells like the timber and I can hear the drainage. The real reason is that 4 years of listening for something outside in the dark has calibrated me to the sounds of that specific piece of land at night. And now anything different from the baseline wakes me, where I would have slept through it before. That's not a complaint. What I want to tell you about the years from 1993 through the early 2000s is how the experience of that spring and summer changed the way I moved through the world. Not dramatically, not in ways that anyone watching from outside would have been able to name. I still went to the assessor's office on Thursdays. I still went to the First Methodist, though I'd stopped teaching Sunday school in 1991 because I found that the things I was certain about had shifted in ways that made it hard to be a teacher. Not because I'd lost faith, but because faith in something particular and organized requires a narrower world than the one I'd been living in since April of 1989, and I wasn't willing to make my world smaller again. I started a correspondence with a woman named Helen Wickham, who wrote for a small periodical out of Eugene, Oregon, that covered Pacific Northwest natural history and what she called anomalous phenomena, which was a careful phrase for what she was actually writing about. I'd found a reference to her in one of the Byrne accounts. She'd done an interview with Byrne in the late 70s about the Patterson film, which was the film shot at Bluff Creek in Northern California in 1967 that most people have seen at some point. The footage of the large bipedal animal walking through a clearing and looking back over its shoulder at the camera. Helen had written a careful, skeptical, ultimately inconclusive piece about the film's authenticity that impressed me with its rigor. I tracked down an address for the periodical and wrote her a letter in the fall of 1993, not about my own situation, but asking about her methodology and what sources she found most credible. She wrote back. We corresponded for 4 years. I eventually told her what had happened, in a letter I wrote over 3 separate evenings in the winter of 1995, and which came out to 11 pages long. I sent it certified mail. She wrote back 2 weeks later, a letter that was equally long, and that is one of the most valuable documents I own. She told me that the juvenile encounter pattern I'd described, the separation, the proximity-seeking behavior, the plant-based foraging, the adult retrieval over an extended period, was consistent with every credible juvenile account she had gathered in 20 years of research. She told me that the stick structure I'd found at the fence post was a type that appeared in documented reports from the Olympic Peninsula and the Northern Cascades going back to the 1950s, always at a specific location that had been used as an entry point or boundary by the animal involved. She said the prevailing interpretation among the small number of researchers who took the subject seriously was that such structures were markers, left deliberately to indicate the passings or the departure of the animal that made them. She said she had no way to tell me whether that interpretation was correct. She died in 1999. Stroke. I found out from a note in the periodical, which ceased publication later that year. I've thought about her a lot since. She was one of 3 people I told the whole of this to during the first decade after it happened, and she was the only one who treated it as data rather than as a story. The other 2 were Roy. I called Roy in 1994, the first time I'd spoken to him in 7 years, because I needed to tell someone who knew me before and who would understand the difference between the woman who had lived in that house and the woman I was describing, and my doctor, a man in Stevenson named Tom Fielding, who I'd been seeing since 1982, and who I told in 1995 during an annual physical, when he asked, as he always did, whether anything had changed. Something changed in 1989, I said, and I told him. He listened without interrupting, which is not as common in doctors as you'd want. When I finished, he said, I believe you. Then he said, I've had one other patient in this county who described something similar. Then he said, it's not my place to put you in touch with each other, but if you ever want me to, Just say so. I never said so. I've thought about that unnamed other patient more than once. The Krantz book that I'd checked out of the library in 1989 was republished in 1992 in an expanded edition, and I bought a copy at the Powell's in Portland when I drove down for a dental appointment that year. Krantz had spent the intervening years continuing his track analysis work and had added a chapter on what he called the biomechanics of locomotion. Specifically, the way the gait evidence from tracks was inconsistent with bipedalism evolved for the same purpose as human bipedalism. Human bipedalism is optimized for endurance walking on flat ground. The gait evidence from Sasquatch tracks, Krantz argued, showed a locomotion pattern optimized for steep, irregular terrain, a longer stride than human walking even at the same body height, a mid-foot flexibility that absorbed uneven ground rather than resisting it, a heel strike pattern, suggesting a flatter approach than the pronounced heel-to-toe roll of human walking. He said this was consistent with an animal that had been bipedal for a very long time, but that had been bipedal in a different kind of country than humans. That's a dense argument to summarize, and I'm probably not doing it justice. The point is that the tracks and the way they were made told a story about how the animal moved that went beyond just the size of the foot. I thought about Bramble's movement as I read that chapter, the economy I'd described, the way it placed its weight exactly where it intended, the transitions between bipedal and knuckle walking, the climbing. What Krantz was describing was consistent with what I'd observed in an animal that was still learning its body, still figuring out its own locomotion, but that had the substrate of that evolved pattern already in it. In 1996, a man named John Green published a book that compiled several decades of Sasquatch reports from British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest. Green was Canadian, based in Harrison Hot Springs in BC, and he'd been collecting accounts since the late 1950s. I got a copy through interlibrary loan from the Skamania County Library and read it in a week. What Green had documented, systematically and without obvious embellishment, was a pattern of encounters that stretched the length of the Cascades from British Columbia down through Washington and Oregon and into Northern California, concentrated along specific drainages and ridge systems, with the Wind River drainage of Skamania County appearing by name in 3 separate accounts from the 1960s and 1970s. Not my drainage, but close enough that I sat with the book in my hands for a while before I kept reading. Someone else had been close to what I was close to, in this same country. 20 years before, I'd smelled anything at the fence post. That's a strange feeling, reading that. Like finding a letter in your mailbox that was meant for someone who lived in your house before you. I have read a lot in the years since, more than I expected to, for a woman who was not interested in stories like this before she lived one. What I've read has confirmed most of what I observed. The smell, described almost universally, and always with that warm undertone that people struggled to name. The bipedalism, the tool behavior, the complex vocalizations, all of it documented in accounts from the Pacific Northwest, going back before there were written records to the oral traditions of the Cowlitz and the Yakama and the Lower Chinook, who have names for these animals that predate the word Sasquatch by a long time. The Cowlitz people have traditions about them that describe them not as monsters or threats, but as neighbors, beings with their own territory and their own rules, beings you could have a relationship with if you behaved correctly and minded the boundaries. I find that framing more useful than the monster framing, Not because I'm romantic about it, but because it matches what I observed. A monster doesn't carefully harvest only your ripe beans and leave the immature ones alone. I want to say one more thing about the behavior I observed, and then I'll move on. The retrieval. The fact that adults came for Bramble, found it, and took it back. I have thought about this for 30 years. There are only two explanations for it that I can construct. One is that these animals range over a large enough territory that they could maintain a search for a separated juvenile over months without giving up. If their range in the Wind River drainage is, say, 50 square miles, and given the track evidence I've read from researchers who do this kind of work, 50 square miles per group is a conservative estimate, then searching that territory systematically would be a significant undertaking and would explain why it took from April to October. The other explanation is that they tracked the smell, that Bramble, over 6 months, built up enough of a scent presence on my property that the adults were eventually able to follow it. The wind in that drainage comes predominantly from the southwest, which would carry scent up the slope and away from my property for most of the summer. The northwest winds come in fall, which is exactly when the adults showed up. That timing is not an accident. A researcher would be able to map the prevailing wind patterns for that drainage from NOAA records and test that hypothesis. I am not a researcher, and I haven't done it. But I notice the timing, the Skamania County Bigfoot ordinance I mentioned earlier. I want to say more about that because people sometimes think it's a joke. It is not a joke. It was passed by the county commissioners in April of 1969, and it was revised and strengthened in 1984. The current version makes it a gross misdemeanor to willfully slay, capture, or molest a Sasquatch within county limits, and establishes a $10,000 fine. The commissioners who passed it in 1969 did so because they had been presented with enough credible reports from people in the county, loggers, ranchers, fishermen, people with no particular reason to make anything up, that they concluded there was something in these drainages worth protecting from the kind of person who would try to shoot it for proof. That's a remarkable thing when you sit with it. A county government, in 1969, deciding that something unacknowledged by official science was real enough to deserve legal protection. They knew something. The people who told them knew something. I know something. The gap between what people in this county have known for 50 years and what is officially acknowledged is one of the things I think about when I lie awake in the dark with the window open. I was 46 when this happened. I am 69 now. My property in Skamania County is still mine. I sold 2 of the 14 acres to my neighbor in 2004 to fix the well, but the 12 I kept include the northeast corner where the prints were and the huckleberry patch and the back clearing and the tree line Bramble walked into on an October night in 1989. The stump is still there. The hen pen is gone. I gave up the chickens in 1997 when my knees started giving me trouble. But the post where the door hung is still there because I never got around to pulling it. The plaster casts and the stick structure are on the shelf in the mudroom. They do not need to be labeled. I know what they are. Vashon died in 1997, which is a good long life for a coonhound, and I buried her under the fir at the northeast corner. She knew something was there that first morning in April of 1989, before I did, and she made her peace with it faster than I did. That seems right for her. She was a more practical creature than I was. I have never had another experience like the one I've described. The smell comes through occasionally, maybe 2 or 3 times in a good year, usually in early April or in October, usually from the northeast. I don't know if it's the same animal or a different one. The timber up the drainage is old enough now that the canopy is closing in, and there is more cover than there was in 1989. More of the understory that large animals require if they're going to move without being seen. Skamania County has never had a confirmed official sighting. That doesn't surprise me. Official confirmation requires a body or a live specimen, and these animals do not provide either, which I am not sure is accidental. After Vashon died, I got another dog, a younger coonhound I named Cedar, who is a good dog, but a different kind of dog. Cedar does not sit down at the fence post in the mornings the way Vashon used to. Cedar goes to the northeast corner, sniffs, and keeps moving. She's never stopped and sat down. I have thought about what that means. Either whatever was coming through in those years isn't coming through the same way now, or Cedar is just a different animal than Vashon and doesn't respond the same way to the same stimulus, or there's nothing there anymore. Any of those could be true, and I have no way to know which. In 2008, I finally went back and read Dale's hunting journal. The part in the front, his part. I'd had it on the shelf for 20 years, and I'd written my notes in the back, and I'd never read what he wrote in the front because I wasn't ready. That year, I was ready. He'd been meticulous about it, the way he was meticulous about practical things: date, weather, location, what he saw, what he heard, what he didn't see. He'd hunted the drainages above my property in the falls of 86 and 87, Unit 310, the Wind River Elk Unit, which is what that country is designated for hunting purposes. The entries were straightforward hunting log entries until the second week of October in 87, and then there were two entries that were different. The first said, "Found large tracks above the 3,000-foot line off the main logging road. Not elk, not bear. Haven't seen the pattern before. Photographed them. Estimate 16 to 17 inches. We'll ask Russ." The second, from a week later, said, "Russ says he knows what made the tracks. Said there are stories from the guys who work those roads at night. Said don't worry about it, and don't go back to that area after dark." That's all. Two entries in a 22-year-old's hunting journal in October of 1987, a year before he died. He'd found something in the timber above my property, and he'd asked about it, and he'd been told the same thing the men who work those roads get told. Don't worry about it, and stay out after dark. And then a year later, he was gone, and I was alone in the house, and 6 months after that, the smell came over the fence post, and Vashon sat down and wouldn't move. I've thought about the sequence of that more than I can adequately explain here. Dale found those tracks in 1987. Bramble came to my property in 1989. These animals have ranges that span decades. The drainage above my property was territory that Bramble's group had been using for years before I ever knew they were there. Dale walked that country and found their sign and was told to leave it alone, and he did leave it alone. And then he died, and I was alone, and something in the spring of 1989, some disruption above Forest Road 30, left a juvenile animal without its mother and near enough to a woman who kept food on a stump and left the porch light on. I don't think that sequence means anything in the causal sense. I don't think Bramble came to me because of Dale. I don't think there's a story here about a mother's grief and a wild creature finding her. I have tried very hard not to make that the story, because I don't believe it's the true story, and making it the true story would require me to give the experience a meaning it didn't earn. What I think is simpler and stranger than that. I think these animals have been in these drainages for as long as there have been drainages, and that sometimes a juvenile gets separated, and sometimes a grieving woman's property is the nearest place with reliable food and a body warm enough to be safe. I think what happened in my clearing in 1989 was an accident of proximity and circumstance, and I think that accident gave me something that I needed without knowing I needed it, and that I am grateful for it in a way that has no adequate expression, and that I have been trying to express it for 30 years, and this is as close as I've gotten. I'll tell you the last thing, and then I'm done. In the spring of 1992, 3 years after, I was driving back from Stevenson on the county road, late afternoon, the light going golden the way it does in May, when the days are long again. I came around the curve where the road follows the ridge before it drops down to my turnoff, and there was something in the road ahead of me, 100 yards out, maybe. Standing on the center line, upright. I slowed to a stop. It was looking at the truck. I could not see its face well from that distance in that light. It was large, larger than anything I'd seen on 2 legs that wasn't a human being. The shoulders were broad, and the arms hung at a length that was wrong for a person. It stood in the road for maybe 30 seconds, and then it stepped off the asphalt on the right side and was gone into the brush below the road, which dropped steeply to a creek bottom, and the brush closed behind it, the way brush closes when something large and decided moves through it, all at once, and then nothing. I sat in my truck on the county road for a few minutes. Then I drove home. I don't know if it was bramble. I don't know what 3 years of growth would have looked like. I don't know if they remember the way we remember, or if memory even works the same way for a kind of being that has been in these mountains for longer than there has been anyone to record what it has done, or thought, or felt. I don't know. What I know is this. Whatever was standing in that road had chosen to be seen, the same way whatever left prints in April of 1989 had made no particular effort at concealment. There is a way these animals move through the world that makes it very clear they are choosing what you get to observe and what you don't. And when one of them stands in a road at 4 in the afternoon and waits for your truck to stop, it is not an accident. I nodded at it, which I know sounds absurd. I nodded at the place in the brush where it had gone, the way you nod at a neighbor you see from across the road when you're both driving and you don't stop, but you acknowledge each other. Then I drove home. In 1998, 9 years after the spring bramble came to the ferns, I had a conversation with a woman at the county assessor's office who had transferred from the Klickitat County assessor's office the previous year. Her name was Beverly, and she was about my age, and we got along well because she liked plants, and I liked plants, and we had that to talk about on the slow days. She mentioned once that she'd grown up in the little community of Trout Lake, about 30 miles south of Stevenson, in the shadow of Mount Adams. She said she'd grown up hearing stories. I said, "What kind of stories?" She said the kind her grandmother told, about things in the timber that weren't bears and weren't people, and that you were supposed to leave gifts for at certain times of year. She said she'd always thought her grandmother was eccentric. Then she'd moved to Scammania County, and she'd started to wonder. I didn't tell her anything specific, but I said I thought her grandmother probably wasn't eccentric at all. Beverly looked at me for a moment, and then she said, "You've seen something, haven't you?" And I said I had. And she nodded, and we both went back to our files, and we never spoke about it again. Some conversations are complete in 30 seconds. There is one more thing from the years since that I want to include here. Not because it proves anything, but because it was strange and it stayed with me. In the summer of 2003, I had some trail work done on the slope above the property by a Forest Service volunteer crew out of the Wind River Work Center, a small maintenance project on a path that ran through the national forest land above my back fence, and that had gotten overgrown. The crew was 4 people, college-age kids, working up through the drainage with brush hooks and loppers. They camped up there 2 nights and finished the work on the 3rd day. On the morning of the last day, one of them came to my door, a young man, maybe 20, with that particular look of someone who has slept outside for 2 nights and has something on his mind that he hasn't figured out how to say yet. He said he was sorry to bother me, but he wanted to ask if I knew what the structures were in the timber above my property. "What structures?" I said. He described them. "Sticks," he said, "interlocked. 3 or 4 of them he'd found spread out over about a 1/4 mile of slope. Some of them big," he said, "made of branches you'd need 2 hands to lift. One of them had smaller sticks arranged on top in what he said looked like a pattern." I asked him if he'd taken any down. He said he hadn't. He said he'd thought about it and then left them alone, because they felt like they were supposed to be there. I told him they were probably old hunting blinds from a deer hunter. He looked at me in the way young people look at you when they know you're not telling them the real thing, but they're too polite to say so. Then he said, "Thank you," and went back up the slope. I went inside and wrote that in the composition notebook. Then I went to the northeast corner and looked at the tilted fence post for a while. Then I came in and made coffee. The huckleberries are coming in well this year. I put fresh berries on the stump last Tuesday, and by the morning they were gone, which could be deer, could be a bear, could be the local ravens who've been working that corner of the yard since spring. Could be something else. I don't worry about which. I just put them out, and what takes them, and I go to bed with the window cracked, and most nights the forest is just a forest, and the wind moves the firs, and the creek runs in the drainage, and there's nothing in it but normal things. Some nights there's a smell on the air, warm and deep, under the fur and the damp, like something alive and particular, and entirely itself. Those nights I don't close the window. I lie in the dark and I listen to the forest, and I think about Dale, and about 6 months of evenings on a back porch with a creature that had no language for what it meant to lose someone, and that sat with me anyway. In the clearing, in the October dark, for no reason I can name, except that it did. That's everything I have. That's the whole of it. If you've heard something like this before, not the precise facts, the shape of it, the feeling of something wild at the edge of your property that came for reasons of its own and left the same way, I'd like to know. Drop it in the comments. I'm not looking for validation, and I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I just think these things should be said out loud while there are still people alive to say them. Stay in the light when you can. And if you can't, stay still.